Good afternoon. Welcome once again to another very topical and very timely EMET webinar. As most of you, I'm sure, have heard, at the request of the Palestinians, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, Fatou Bensouda, has opened up an investigation of Israel for supposed war crimes committed in the 2014 war over Gaza. Many of us remember what happened to the communities surrounding Gaza before the war, and what prompted them to go to war against this Hamas-controlled entity. Hamas, by the way, has been listed by the United States State Department as a terrorist organization since 1997. And it had relentlessly launched over 1,000 missiles on its neighboring Israeli cities and farmlands, creating a reign of terror for many of the families that live there. We are really privileged today to have with us one of the most renowned international legal experts in the world, Avi Bell. And he is going to answer for us a number of questions, such as, under international law, was this referral about Israel justified? And why was Israel engaged in the war against Hamas-controlled Gaza in the first place? And does the ICC's territorial jurisdiction extend to the disputed territories that Israel captured in its defensive war of 1967. And finally, knowing the makeup of the ICC, is there any possibility that Israel will receive a fair investigation and a fair trial? Professor Avi Bell, as I said, is one of the world's most renowned legal scholars of international law. He's a professor at the University of San Diego School of Law and at Bar-Ilan University's Faculty of Law. And Avi is also a senior fellow at the very prestigious Kohelet Policy Forum. And he is a dean of the Tikva Summer Institute of Law. It's the actual title is Law, Governance, and the Foundations of Democracy in International Perspective. Avi has been deeply involved in public service and diplomacy, assisting various nonprofit organizations with training, legal advice, strategic directions, and has consulted with and given testimony to officials and committees of Parliament, of the U.S. Congress, and of international organizations on 6 continents. So without further ado, here to tell us the entire story of this referral and its justification or not is Avi Bell. Thank you, Avi.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to getting Antarctica in there so I can get all 7 continents. But in the meantime, thank you very, very much for having me. One of the wonderful things about webinars is that I can do this from my living room in Jerusalem, in my virtual library that you see behind me, and speak to the world. I'm going to jump from this lecture when we're done to San Diego. So I have to try to keep to our schedule. All right, so I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to take the long way around this. I want to talk a little bit about the court before I talk about the particulars of the actions regarding Israel. So I don't know, I presume that the audience is of a varied background. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the ICC, but the ICC is a relatively new institution. It was created at the turn of the century, the turn of the millennium. It came into force after there's a treaty that created it. The treaty came to force in 2002. It's been around since then. It was created to, as it says, to tackle the worst of crimes, international crimes that had up until that point gone unpunished. It was set up so that with limited capacity, so that it would have only supplementary jurisdiction. The jurisdiction of the court is over crimes that are committed by nationals of states that have joined the court or that have taken place in the territory of states that have joined the court. And even then, the court is only supposed to hear the case if the state finds itself unable to do so. So if the state brings charges, the court is not supposed to get involved. And the court is doing this as a way, essentially, of giving those states that want to have serious criminal proceedings against human rights violators and war criminals the ability to do so through a prestigious international institution with a permanent staff of prosecutor's office and judges. Now, that's the theory. Now, here's the reality. Okay? The reality is that in the nearly 20 years of its existence, you can count the successful prosecutions of the court on one hand. Okay, that's just a shocking record. Defendants have been selected mostly politically. There is a judicial staff. There are 18 judges that sit on various panels in the court. They mostly do not have a background in international criminal law. The prosecutor's office has also been accused, I think rightly, of not behaving fully professionally. The institution is now in crisis. It's been pressed for spending vast amounts of money to get very little by way of results, and for the politicization of the cases. To date, all of the handful of successful prosecutions, they've all been of African defendants. And with this pressure, the court has been looking for a way to expand its repertoire, that is to get convictions against non-Africans. It's not looking to get more professional, apparently, nor is it looking to get less political. It's just looking to expand its political focus. And what that means is that the court is now looking for defendants from non-state parties. And that means they are looking for defendants from the United States. And it looks, of course, they are looking for defendants from Israel. Now, the effort of the court to go after Israelis is actually quite old. It goes all the way back to before the court actually started functioning, when the treaty was drafted. There was a provision that was put in the treaty already that was an expansion, was a brand new crime of indirect transfer of population to territories that are occupied. It was a very obvious attempt to criminalize the settlement of Jews in the disputed West Bank and East Jerusalem. This, among other reasons, was why Israel decided that it was not a wise move, would not be a wise move to join the treaty, and it did not. The United States similarly decided to stay out of this institution. But nonetheless, even though the court had no obvious way to get at to scratch the itch to prosecute Israelis, it started cooking up, together with the Palestine Liberation Organization, a scheme for getting Israelis into the court. And the way that they decided to do this was to label the Palestine Liberation Organization a state of Palestine, and then claim that Israelis are doing crimes on the territory of this state of Palestine. Now, this all started in 2009. The Palestine Liberation Organization submitted a reference to the prosecutor of the court at that time, Luis Moreno Ocampo, in which, claiming to speak on behalf of this state of Palestine, they wanted to give the court jurisdiction. Ocampo sat on that for a number of years. He did some PR work on its behalf, in which he held various conferences in which he claimed to be considering this seriously. But ultimately, before leaving office, he issued a letter, an opinion, in which he said that because he's not sure that there is actually, under international law, a state of Palestine. There isn't. He said what the Palestinians could always do is they could go to the General Assembly, and if the General Assembly voted in a resolution to accept the so-called state of Palestine as a non-member observer state, then we would have to allow them to join the treaty in the court without getting into any of the other questions. And so naturally, having done that, they then took that letter to the General Assembly. After a few months, the General Assembly voted to recognize the state of Palestine as a non-member observer state of the United Nations. And then in January 2015, the Palestinians took this back to the ICC, to the International Criminal Court, and said, we want to give you jurisdiction. Now, their reference of jurisdiction in 2015 was phrased carefully. They gave jurisdiction retroactively to June 13th, 2014. They chose that date carefully. It was on June 12th, 2014, that Palestinian terrorists kidnapped and murdered 3 Jewish teenagers, hitchhikers. And the idea, of course, was to make sure that if there were any temptation in the ICC to actually prosecute Palestinian criminals, to make sure that that temptation was tamped down at the outset. Although, of course, I'm not sure why they would ever be worried. It's been quite clear that there's no interest in going after Palestinian criminals. At any rate, the Palestinians have been working together, the PLO has been working together with the prosecutor's office since 2015 to push forward an investigation of Israeli defendants, to develop this theory that because there's a state of Palestine and Israel does things that they want to complain about on territory of Palestine, that Israelis should be prosecuted. Now, according to the statute of the court, the prosecutor has to issue a yearly report on the status of every preliminary investigation. And so we know since 2015 what's been going on with the preliminary investigation into the so-called situation of Palestine. And what we know is that the prosecutor duly every year reports that she's looking into all sorts of horrible things that Israelis have done, such as Jews living in the old city of Jerusalem, which, as we all know, is one of the worst crimes against humanity imaginable. She hasn't quite explained the theory by which this is a crime, but she's duly reported that she's looking into that one. And she's also duly ignored every year actual Palestinian crimes, except in the most oblique way, right? And this has gone, to 2015, 2016, 2017. In 2018, the Palestinians were pleased enough with this that they joined as a full member of the court, having previously just given a reference for a particular set of crimes, although they didn't change the date, still June 13th, 2014. And finally, in December 2019, the prosecutor, the outgoing prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, said that she'd reached a result. Surprise, surprise, she decided there is a state of Palestine and has territory, and there are Israeli defendants that she wants to launch a full investigation about in order to see if there's grounds for charging them. Now, she asked the time that a pretrial chamber of the court give its opinion on whether her conclusions were correct, stating, by the way, that she didn't really care what they said because anyway, as far as she was concerned, she had jurisdiction no matter what they did. And they sat on that for a long enough time for us to get to the point where we're at the end of her term. She will be, Fatou Bensouda will be stepping down during the summer and replaced by Karim Khan, who is a UK lawyer. But the result of the pretrial chamber was not at all surprising, and it was that there is a state of Palestine there is territory of Palestine. The court is explicit about this. They're not sure that those are correct results according to international law, but as far as the court is concerned, there's a state and there's territory, and that's good enough to go after Israelis. Now, I say it's not surprising. It's not surprising because, of course, the judges of the court have been even more biased against Israel than the prosecutor has been. And so one of the lowlights of the jurisprudence of the court has been a complaint that was made by the Comoros Islands regarding the Israeli seizure by force of a boat that was trying to illegally breach the Israeli naval blockade of Gaza. Now, under international law, to breach a naval blockade that has been lawfully declared and operated is an act of war, and states are within their rights to sink ships without further inquiry, as long as it is clear that they're there to breach the blockade and do not intend to divert. Those ships can be sunk. What Israel did in 2010 with a flotilla of ships that was trying to breach the blockade was they seized the ships. On one of the ships, the Mavi Marmara, which was registered in the Comoros Islands, as the Israelis boarded the boat, they were attacked by a bunch of hired goons that were using knives and pipes and the rest. And eventually, the Israeli soldiers used handheld weapons, and about a dozen people were killed on board the boat. The Comoros Islands asked the prosecutor to prosecute on the grounds that this too was a war crime. Of course, it wasn't. But the prosecutor said, yes, it looks like a war crime, but this is just not important enough to spend my time on. As you know, I've got to get a conviction every 4 years or so, and I don't want to waste it on this. And so she closed the case. They appealed to the pretrial chamber to force her to reopen it. The pretrial chamber said that her decision was no good. She has to reconsider it. She reconsidered it and said, no, really, I don't want to bring this case. It's just not important enough. They ordered her to rethink her rethinking. And then a third time, she decided to close the case. Now, this comedy of these repeated orders to reconsider the decision. Now, she's clearly right, by the way, that the prosecutor is clearly right that this is not important. And one of the conditions of the statute is don't bring charges unless they're of sufficient gravity. The fact that pretrial chamber kept ordering her to go back and prosecute Israelis tells us everything we need to know about the judges. Now, there's one more thing that we need to know about the judges that comes out of the decision of the last few weeks. So as we know, as I said, the court, the pretrial chamber of the court, approved Bensouda's request to find that there's jurisdiction over the, quote, state of Palestine and, quote, the territory of the state of Palestine, and therefore grounds for investigating Israel. The response, the most interesting response of that was the response by the Hamas terrorist organization, which thanked the court for its decision and said it's a decision that, quote, contributes to supporting the rights of the Palestinian people and defends their freedom. Now, this is something that should really strike you, because as a technical legal matter, what the court decided was that there's a state of Palestine. Palestinian defendants can be charged with crimes and brought before the court. Now, Hamas is a terrorist organization. Its members commit war crimes under the statute. Hamas is also, by the way, according to its charter, a genocidal organization. It aims to commit genocide, and by killing people with that aim, it has committed crimes of genocide. Now, Hamas, in addition to this, has also committed all sorts of other crimes against humanity. It has committed torture. It has done various things that violate practically every provision of the statute you can think of. Now, why would a criminal organization thank the court for deciding it has jurisdiction? The reason is Hamas knows what the rest of us knows, which is the results are known in advance. There is no chance whatsoever that any Hamas criminal will sit in the dock in that court. It'll never happen. What they want to have happen is, and what will happen unless there's something to stop this train, what will happen is that the new prosecutor will come into office, have an investigation which will come to the conclusion that there is room to charge Israeli defendants with terrible crimes like lawfully defending their country in military service or living in places that the Palestinians think they ought not to live. And that will result in the presentation of criminal charges, and those criminal charges will go out in the form of arrest warrants, and that's where things will end, because I can't imagine that any Israeli defendant would be foolish enough to show up in the court and permit themselves to be judged by that kangaroo court. Now, as I said, it's not just Israel. There are potential United States defendants as well. The court is looking to go after defendants from non-state parties, and is looking to do so because it can't really go after them from state parties. It's a political institution. So the same thing that tells the court that it's not going to go after criminals from the so-called state of Palestine tells it that it's not going to go after criminals from the state of France. Right? And so they're not going to do that, but they are very interested in bringing Americans on charges. And in fact, there have been already several moves towards that. The United States has actually been fairly good, bipartisan, in opposing ICC jurisdiction. There are several pieces of important legislation on this. From 2002, there's what's called the American Service Members Protection Act, which authorizes the president to use force to liberate any American service member who is taken into custody by the court. It also, by the way, allows the use of force if members of certain allied states are taken into custody, which includes Israel. Specifically when it comes to the issue of the Palestinian attempt to use the court against Israelis, there is legislation from 2015, the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2015 states, and I'm quoting, right, none of the funds appropriated under the heading of Economic Support Fund in this act may be made available for assistance for the Palestinian Authority if after the date of enactment of this act, and I'll jump forward, the Palestinians initiate an international criminal court judicially authorized investigation or actively support such an investigation that subject Israeli nationals to an investigation for alleged crimes against Palestinians. It's pretty clear that this has been triggered, and it would seem that under US legislation, it is no longer lawful to give the Palestinians aid under the Economic Support Fund. It's also possible to take further measures. The Trump administration imposed sanctions on the prosecutor staff in the ICC, and arguably, if the ICC prosecutors take moves to try to take non-member defendants into custody, that constitutes kidnapping. But it would seem to me that the weakest point, the point of attack on this for the United States ought to be on the Palestinians rather than on the court itself. The court itself is not financially supported by the United States, and frankly, that's all they care about. But they have no jurisdiction in this case unless they continue to claim that there was a state of Palestine that gave them jurisdiction. And so if in fact the Biden administration is going to renew financial support to the Palestinians, this would be a good opportunity to inform them that it won't happen unless they withdraw their jurisdiction from the ICC. If they do so, that is the end of the proceeding. Now, there are other legal questions you asked about the fighting in Gaza, but I'm going to leave that for further discussion. I'll tell you why. The reason is that I think it's a mistake to look at this as a set of proceedings that's interested in clarifying the application of international law. The ICC is not a legal institution. It's a political institution, right? We know what the results are going to be without having to know anything about the law. As long as the ICC continues to be an institution that is celebrated by criminal organizations and feared by the law-abiding, there is no reason to take it seriously as an institution of law, and every reason to fear it as a gang of supporters of criminals.
Wonderful. I have a bunch of questions. And I should have said, Avi, by the way, went to University of Chicago, one of the best schools, got his JD from University of Chicago, then went on to Harvard to have his PhD. And among all of his wonderful, wonderful attributes, he also is a new father of Chaim Ariel, and who is 6 months old. So mazel tov.
Accomplishment.
Right, quite, that's it, right, at best. Anyway, so I do have this law, which our board member, who is a wonderful attorney, Lori Reagan, brought to our attention. And this is part of the appropriations bill for 2021 as well. So I think since they are serious, one of the things that we have to make as a priority is to let them know that we can no longer give any economic assistance to the Palestinian Authority as long as they proceed in doing this. And I think, everyone who is on today should write their member of Congress and let them know that this actually is a violation of American law. Because I know that the Biden administration, one of the first things they announced was that they were going to resume aid to the Palestinian Authority. So since neither the United States or Israel are a part of the ICC, who is going to, are there going to be any arguments in defense of Israel here, and who's going to put forth those arguments?
Well, it's interesting that actually a number of state parties, including ones that I wouldn't expect, like Germany, state parties in the ICC have informed the court that they think this is a mistake, that there is no state of Palestine under international law, and is a mistake to pursue the investigation on this obvious legal error. I'm not entirely surprised by this, because it is exposing the court to criticism that it's clearly political and not legal. I mean, the decision is clearly in the wrong legally, and justified primarily by politics. That said, I don't think that any of them are going to go to the mat. Going to the mat against the prosecutor or against the judges means threatening to cut off their contributions, and they're not going to. Right? If enough states threaten to cut off their contributions, that would change the direction of the ICC. And again, it's because it's a political institution which cares about one thing only, which is bringing the money in. Right.
Okay. So what are the consequences? Will there be Israelis that will be afraid to travel, afraid that they could be, will there be an Interpol arrest warrant that might possibly be issued against some of these Israeli defendants?
Yeah, so as I said, I think that unless the political pressure on the ICC is great enough for them to back down, and at the moment I don't see that, but it might happen. But if it does not happen, if there's not enough political pressure for them to back down, then the inevitable result will be there will be arrest warrants for Israeli defendants. There will probably, by the way, this is a less easy case for the ICC because the United States is more powerful politically, but there will probably be arrest warrants for Americans as well. Now, what will the result of this be? What the United States has done is that it's signed bilateral agreements with more than 50 countries where the countries agree that they will never turn an American over to the ICC. This is something that Israel's going to have to start doing more seriously. But yeah, Israelis will have to be careful where they travel. It will turn out that the ICC will look to snatch them when it can and hold kangaroo court proceedings. And so they will have to be very careful.
Kafka is alive and well and is living in The Hague, really. So now I'm going to introduce you to Benjamin Whale, who is our wonderful director of the program for Israel's national security, who will be reading some of the questions that have come in. Thank you, Benjamin.
Great.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Avi, for your 30 minutes on the ICC. We've got a number of questions come in, and we'll try to get to all of them. The first one is, has the Biden administration commented on anything going on at the ICC right now?
So the Biden administration has said that it disagrees with this decision. This decision is wrong. The decision to go after Israelis under the guise of recognizing a state of Palestine and its territory as including the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza is an incorrect decision. And I think that that reflects something that I mentioned earlier, and I think it's important to note. There is a bipartisan consensus on the ICC not having jurisdiction over non-state defendants. And it's because the United States sees, it's in both parties, the US sees that this is not going to stop with Israeli defendants. American service members are also targets of this political activity.
An audience member of ours points out that the ICC chief prosecutor told the Palestinian Authority that its pay-for-slay policy could be a war of crime. Are you aware of this, that this actually happened, and would it in fact be considered as a war crime?
Okay, so acts of terrorism, that is the killing of civilians within the context of deliberate targeting of and killing of civilians in the context of the conflict, is very clearly a war crime. And when you add the various motivations behind it, it clearly constitutes crime against humanity too. So if this were a legal institution, I think that it's very obvious that the terrorists themselves would be criminals, and those who are paying them for the acts, which by the way is not just the Palestinian Authority, it's also a number of institutions in Europe, for example, are passing along money knowing that that's where it's going to go. The paying of those terrorists is aiding and abetting. It's also criminal under the law. Now, all that said, this is not a legal institution. There is no chance whatsoever, zero, that any Palestinian will be charged with funding terrorism. Certainly not any member of the Palestinian Authority. It's not because it's lawful for them to pay the terrorists. It's not. It's a crime. It's because the court is not interested in prosecuting Palestinian criminals.
The next question is, it could be argued that Gaza is part of a future Palestinian Authority state. Thus, it could be argued that crimes by the Palestinian Authority against civilians are crimes against humanity. Since Israel is not a party, who could bring these claims in front of the ICC prosecutor?
Okay, I'm going to rephrase the question a little bit. Okay, so whether or not the Palestinians have a state, they don't at the moment. But that doesn't prevent Palestinians today from committing acts that are criminal under international law. So when Palestinian terrorists, for example, target Israeli civilians as such, they're committing international crimes. They're committing war crimes, and they're committing crimes of terrorism. And there are international treaties on terrorist crimes, and states have a duty to prosecute those crimes as well. The question about whether there's a state of Palestine has to do with the court's jurisdiction, right? And so the court only has jurisdiction if the crimes take place in the territory of a state party, or if they take place, or if they're committed by a citizen of a state party. Now, the court already has jurisdiction over some Palestinian terrorists because they hold Jordanian citizenship. And Jordan is a state party. And so those Palestinian terrorists who have Jordanian citizenship are already under jurisdiction of the court without any need to resort to this fiction that there's a state of Palestine. Now, I say that knowing that as well, the prosecutors ignored this and has no interest in pursuing cases against Palestinian criminals, whether they hold Jordanian citizenship or not, and it's not going to. And so if you ask about Hamas criminals or other Palestinian criminals in the Gaza Strip, are they criminals? They're already criminals today, whether they become a state in the future or not. And it's possible that some of them already are under the jurisdiction of the court without this fiction, but they won't be prosecuted. There's no chance. They just won't be.
And actually, as a follow-up to that question, one of our audience members asked, may a citizen of a signatory country living in Sderot bring a case against the Palestinian Authority for Hamas crimes? So
no, nobody can bring cases in the International Criminal Court except the prosecutor, right? This is a criminal court that has two institutions. It has the judges and it has the prosecutor's office. The only people who can present charges are the prosecutor's office, and it goes through the prosecutor, right? So if whether or not somebody is take any victim of a crime, like civilians living in Sderot who are targeted as civilians by Palestinian terrorists. They are victims of crimes. Does it add anything to the jurisdiction of the court that the victim has citizenship in a state party? No. Jurisdiction is determined by whether the crimes took place in the territory of a state party or were committed by a citizen of the state party, right? So it doesn't add anything. And anyway, it doesn't make a difference because they can't file the charges. The only one who can file charges is the prosecutor, which is why, again, this brings us back to that you have to understand that this is a political, not a legal institution. And she and her successor, Mr. Khan, are not going to charge Palestinian terrorists with crimes. Now, I will say that I know that there have been requests filed by by civilian victims in Sderot asking for the prosecutor to prosecute the Palestinian criminals, right? And I know also what has happened and what is going to happen with those requests. They're going nowhere.
And what countries are behind and are major supporters of the ICC?
So I don't remember the exact figures. The biggest money is obviously coming from Europe, but there's others. Like Australia gives a substantial amount of money. Now it's a pretty standard institution that's linked to the UN, meaning that the money comes from the West. The agenda is not driven by the West, or at least not by the governments of the West, right? And so it really is a question if they want to seize control of this institution before it fails completely, if it hasn't already. By my estimation, it's not only already failed completely, it's at this point an embarrassment.
Is there a way to go after the funding of the ICC?
Yes, there is, but it involves lobbying state by state. So go to Britain, go to Germany, go to France, go to Australia. No, I'm saying, and I don't think it's a bad effort. I think it's a very good effort to go through. I think that there's only one thing, as I said, that the ICC will listen to, that the prosecutor will listen to, the judges will listen to, which is political pressure, which primarily is going to have to be in the form of fear that their budgets will be taken away.
Can an Israeli defendant be arrested in another country?
Yeah, so they put out international warrants. Now, I'll say more than that. Every state party has a duty to turn over a defendant once such a warrant is issued. Now, that said, they don't always do that, right? So there's a fairly prominent case in which the ICC wanted to put on trial the senior leadership of Sudan for a variety of crimes against humanity. And there were warrants put out. And the former president of Sudan traveled to a number of countries, including the state of Jordan, which, as I said, is a state party to the ICC. And he landed there, and the ICC demanded that Jordan arrest him and turn him over. And Jordan neglected to act on that request, and he went home. So I'm sure there will be arrest warrants. It doesn't mean that the states are actually going to deliver up those people.
And in terms of the trial, if this were to move forward as planned with the new prosecutor, et cetera, would you be able to walk us through the timetable of what we're looking at, how many months, what the process exactly is of such a trial? Okay,
so there's a long process before you get to a trial. Okay, now the way it works is that before there can be anyone charged, and the charges are always against individuals, not against states. It wouldn't be the state of Israel that's being charged. It would be Israelis being charged, Israeli politicians, Israeli military leaders, Israeli soldiers, Israeli civilians. That's, it would be individuals. Before they get to the point where they're charged against these individuals, there first has to be something called an investigation. And in fact, all this preliminary stuff up till now was the preliminaries before an investigation. It was a preliminary investigation to decide whether to have an investigation. And what the pretrial chamber just greenlighted was an investigation. Now, what that means is that the prosecutor's office has to notify the relevant state parties that it's starting an investigation. And then once it does so, right, once they're notified, they will start, the prosecutor's office will start, quote, investigating. Now the investigation, how long will it take? I mean, basically the point of investigation is to try to gather enough evidence to be able to allow the court to convict the person, the defendant, without it looking too obviously like a stage trial. There's not a very good record of collecting such evidence. I'll say, by the way, this is not a problem only for the International Criminal Court. It's a problem with lots of international courts. There's a fabulous book by a law professor named Nancy Coombs. And I can't remember the name at the moment. I'm misremembering the name. It's something like Convictions Without Evidence, but that's not the name. It's something close to that. But basically what she went through is not the ICC, but a number of different international tribunals looking at the evidentiary basis of their convictions. And she was quite critical, and I think rightly so. What you're looking at is proceedings where in advance they decide who's right and who's wrong, and the group that's labeled victim is believed no matter how incredible the testimony is, and the group that's labeled perpetrator is guilty from the outset. And so it's that we're not looking at proceedings by which you get a very good evidentiary basis. Nevertheless, they will need to have something. And so the investigation will be about collecting enough stuff that they can hold this kangaroo court proceeding without embarrassing themselves too much. How long will that take? Could be a year and a half, could be 10 years, right? There have been investigations that just seem to never end, right? I think they're just now we're getting to the end of one proceeding where there's an ongoing investigations in Uganda of more than a decade, right? So the investigation, by the way, even after you get the first charge, will probably not end either, right? If it's a year and a half from now or 10 years from now, it can keep running and producing more defendants, which I think is what will happen. And so at some point, call it 2 years out, we'll see the first criminal charges. There'll be an issuing of an arrest warrant, and then it'll just keep running on for forever. Now, how long will the trial take? I don't know if there's this for certain, but I suspect that most Israelis understand that to show up in the court is to expose themselves to a proceeding that is political rather than legal, and which will not give them a fair trial. Now, the rules of the ICC are that it cannot judge in absentia. The defendant has to be present there. So as long as an Israeli refuses to show up there, does not allow themselves to be turned over to the court, which means not traveling or the like, there won't be any trials.
Thank you. I mean, it's very interesting. I know that the ICC has a lot of bylaws, and there's a lot of conflict between the international law and the internal law in some countries, such as Israel. So I'm sure it'll be very interesting. But can the Prime Minister of Israel or any Prime Minister be charged? And if so, and you did mention maybe some politicians being on the target list, can either of them use their diplomatic immunity in some capacity or in their full capacity?
Nope. No diplomatic immunity, they can be charged. That's the quick answer, right? And it has happened, okay? They've charged presidents of states. The prosecutor would have absolutely no problem charging the Prime Minister of Israel or any other senior elected leader. And by the way, I would expect it. I can't think of something more certain than filing of criminal charges against the Prime Minister. The only thing that will block this is political pressure on the ICC, so it decides not to further pursue this. But assuming there isn't such sufficient pressure, the investigation will, at some point, 18 months out, 2 years out, whatever, lead to the first criminal charges. And I would say that first batch will almost certainly include the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much. And another question that came in, would Biden's plan to resume funding of the Palestinian Authority, which has the pay-for-slay policy, to be considered as a war of crime, would Biden or his administration be subject to investigation by the ICC as well, or is that a little more detached from direct, we'll call it direct link to war crime?
Well, again, there is within the statute a provision for aiding and abetting, and so if one gives to a group of persons with a common purpose, where that group of persons with a common purpose is committing crimes, and one knows that one's contribution will be used for those crimes, that makes you an aider and abetter. Okay, so. Anyone, it doesn't make a difference where they are, anyone who does such a thing as an aider and abetter is a criminal. Will the court have jurisdiction over them? No, it won't have jurisdiction over them. And will the court bring charges against them? Not a chance in the world. When the court, I do think, is interested in going after American defendants, this is not the one that they will want to do it on. Right? There's just right, it's a much bigger political fight to take on the United States than to take on Israel. Israel's sort of a gimme, most of the supporters of the court can't stand Israel anyway, and so they don't mind the court going after Israelis with the flimsiest of cases. But when they start going after the United States, they're going to have to build something that looks a little better.
Can I just ask a question? Then is that okay? Now, this is in two parts. One, how long is the reign of the chief prosecutor? And Two, why has it taken so long? Was Fatou Bensouda waiting for President Trump's administration to end and President Biden's to begin?
No, her term ran out. I mean, she could have gone for another term, but her term ran out. And they serve long terms, right? So you have Khan, when he comes in this summer, will be only the third prosecutor of the court. So they're 7-year terms. It's possible for them to step down early, but they're 7-year terms. Yeah. Right. So we've had 3 terms so far.
Right. So, but my question is more, she's wanted to bring charges against Israel for the last 6 years. Why suddenly now?
Well, she asked the pretrial chamber to approve this in December 2019. She wasn't waiting.
I see.
The court just moves glacially. It moves really slowly. And it's not. Nothing is going to happen from today till tomorrow. I mean, I'm sure that if it were up to her, she would file charges already, file the first charge sheet tomorrow. But they have this internal bureaucracy, and they don't want it to look too obviously biased. And so there's going to be a, quote, investigation for a little bit before anything gets into a charge sheet. And I think that she will also not want to make it look like she's handcuffing her successor. So she will leave to Khan the hard work of presenting the eventual charge sheets. But the personnel, the bureaucracy of the prosecutor's office is not going to change. And you can see from the last turnover, from Moreno-Ocampo to Bensouda, that it went pretty smoothly as far as Moreno-Ocampo setting up the legal theory by which they were going to go after Israelis, and then Bensouda running with it. Bensouda set things up so that now Khan can get to ultimately charging Israelis. This is a multi-year effort, multi-prosecutor effort.
So it seems like the best kind of defense we could do is to quote from the 2021 appropriations law and let the administration know that they cannot be funding the Palestinian Authority while they're bringing up these charges to the ICC. Unless, of course, but there is some waiver authority if they say it's for America's national security interests.
I'd have to look at the legislation again. I actually think that bit was not waivable. But you probably have looked at the legislation more recently.
Yeah, it does say the Secretary of State may waive the restriction and clause and there's a number of things, and if it will assist in furthering Middle East peace is one of the things, which yes, amorphous.
I mean, ultimately, all of these legislative tools are a question of what the administration wants to achieve. It's not a question of what's in there, right? And so, there are other ways around this as well. Even if if the Biden administration doesn't want to waive that, it can pass along assistance through a different framework. And the Palestinians actually have a bigger problem with accepting assistance from the United States right now, because there's other legislation that it basically creates jurisdiction over Palestinian terrorists in U.S. courts as a result of the Palestinian Authority accepting aid. And that really bothers them, because it's very clear that there are Palestinian terrorists who would be convicted if they were put up, if they had to answer for their actions in a real court of law, like U.S. courts. And so that really scares them. But there's a question of the administration's will. It is true, though, that the weakest point, the point at which I think it's easiest to derail this proceeding, is the Palestinian Authority. Right? If PLO, the / Palestinian Authority, withdraws its accession to the court, if it informs the court that it is not a state of Palestine, or that it has withdrawn its Article 12.3 reference and its accession to the court, then there is no jurisdiction under what the court has already said, right? In this case, right? Basically the court's entire theory is based on the idea that the state of Palestine has authorized it to investigate. So if there is no state of Palestine, or if the state of Palestine withdrawn that authorization, that's the end. And so it would seem to me that's the point, the weakest point, the point where the fewest number of actions will lead to the best result. That said, the Palestinians don't want to give this up easily. They view this as one of their highest priority items. And so it really is a question of how hard the administration is going to push on this. If it wants to, it can get the result, but I don't think that it'll get it unless it really pushes hard.
Avi, one other question is, in the same appropriations bill, the funds could be prevented from being appropriated to the PA if the first clause is the Palestinians obtain the same standing as member states or full membership as a state in the United Nations or any specialized agency thereof outside an agreement negotiated between Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, they've already
done at least a half dozen times.
Right.
Yeah, so there is already the authority to do this.
Right.
There's the authority to cut off aid. The Trump administration did cut off aid.
Right.
But it's not a question of is there authority to cut off aid. The question is there a desire not only to cut off aid, but is there a desire to use the leverage that the United States has to push the Palestinians into giving up their lawfare, their campaign at the ICC. There was Trump administration pressure. It wasn't enough to persuade the Palestinians to change their course. I would suspect it's because the Palestinians were confident that things would be different if in a new administration, and it's really up to the Biden administration to prove to the Palestinians that gamble was wrong, that they won't get away with this.
Right. All right. I want to thank you so much, Avi Bell, for your moral clarity and for your intellectual rigor and expertise. I think what I might spend some of today doing is writing up a letter, a prototypical letter that we can send to all of our members and others who have joined us today to send to their member of Congress, that the Palestinian Authority should not be, at least according to the way the appropriations bill was written, they can't have their cake and eat it at the same time. Both, go to the ICC and get funding from the United States. So I really want to thank you so much. Avi is an international treasure. And I know one of the organizations that you're with is the Kohelet Policy Forum, and I always like to make an appeal for whatever great institution is wise enough to have hired Avi. So if they would like to, support that, and also if you could please support EMET. All of this costs us a great deal, but we really do believe that a well-informed public is probably the best prerequisite for a functioning, thriving democracy, and results in good policy ultimately. So thank you so much, and please join us next week. I think we are going to have a phenomenal speaker talking about the situation in Iran right now. Okay, thanks again for joining us.